Paxton will be able to join on at one point. So the reason why we're recording this is so that other One Young World ambassadors can see what it is that we had to say here in Canada, and also so that the One Young World team in London can sort of take our input and use it as sort of a focus group to build the actual flow of the conference. And the module that we've sort of been specifically given for Canada, it has to do with human rights. So there's sort of two big key themes that have been chosen in the consultation survey for human rights. So one has to do with religious freedoms, and the second one has to do with government surveillance and civil liberties. So yeah, part of these questions works really well with Canada. Some of it is probably a bit less applicable. That's something that will come across as we discuss, and we'll be able to sort of pose what from a Canadian perspective would be some really pertinent questions to have on there. But just before we get started with all of that, I'd just like to do a bit of intro, because I don't know if we all know who each other are, and then I'll talk a bit about the process, about coordinating ambassadors, and about the Ottawa bit as well, because there's some cool stuff happening with that right now. So I don't know if you all know, Ottawa is bidding to be a host city in 2015 or 2016. And so there's a really strong bid committee working right now with the City of Ottawa, Ottawa Tourism, and Media Plus, which is the ad agency that was hired on for the project. So I've been able to do a bit of advising on that bid, and if any of you would like to get involved, we can be in touch. Right now, it's still sort of an intermediate point, but there'll be some really good opportunities for ambassadors to get involved. And the great thing with it as well is that we can also use the bid as an opportunity to get more Canadians out to One Young World this year in Dublin and in subsequent years as well. So the year that Ottawa is actually mostly pushing for is 2016, just so you know. But I'll be updating all of you via email on this. So yeah, so a bit more about who I am. Ilias and I know each other from a couple of conferences, and I think we were in Pittsburgh together for One
We
Young
met
World.
in Zurich,
Yeah.
in Switzerland.
Yeah, in Zurich. Actually, Dominic Shui from Switzerland, a One Young World veteran, is in Toronto right now doing coding talks. So I
Awesome.
met with him the other week. That was cool. Yeah, so I attended One Young World Zurich and One Young World Pittsburgh. I was not there in Joburg last year, but I will be returning this year in Dublin. My background, I work for an NGO called the Global Poverty Project. We're sort of a movement building and campaigns organization around seeking an end to extreme poverty by 2030. We've had an office open in Canada since last year, and I sort of do campaigns, advocacy, lobbying, movement building, that kind of work. We also do a lot of work with the music industry, both here in Canada and internationally. We do a big concert in Central Park every year with the Secretary General of the UN, President of the World Bank, and we usually get a couple of world leaders there. It's called the Global Citizen Festival. So I do that stuff. The other hats that I wear, I worked with an organization called Global Vision Junior Team Canada for a long time, leading young Canadians on trade missions to emerging markets around the world. So did a lot of youth leadership, youth development work that way, and I was lucky enough to do, through that, also a lot of work with First Nations and Aboriginal youth here in Canada, and also up north with Inuit communities and Inuit youth. So that was something that's really unique, and I think that it will be really important in future years for Canada to have a larger and more diverse Aboriginal community be part of One Young World. So I guess, yeah, that's sort of the spiel from my end. If we can maybe go around and just give some quick intros on who we are, what are sort of the spheres or areas that we're active in and that we're passionate about. So maybe if we start with we can start with you, David.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, my name is David. I attended One Young World Joburg. So this is all new to me. And right now, I just finished my second year of university at Western.
That's great.
Looking to go into Ivy in the fall.
Yep.
And I guess some of my areas of interest, one of which I started a nonprofit where we work to help eliminate child poverty through education. We're currently rebuilding dilapidated schools in poverty-stricken regions and countries around the world right now. Apart from that, like at the just at One Young World in Joburg, I really got involved and interested with the whole concept of social business that Mohammed Yunus spoke to us about, and now I have the opportunity to research with both an IB prof and a political science prof at Western to look more into it at a theoretical standpoint and see how we can really apply this into the real world.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Thanks, David. Yeah, the organization that I work with, we're doing some campaigning right now around access to education. The Global Partnership for Education is actually hosting its replenishment conference in June. So we're working hard to make sure that Canada makes a strong commitment to the GBE, which is probably the biggest multilateral organization active in mostly in post-conflict states where education systems are really being built up.
Oh,
So
wow.
if we can maybe go to can we maybe go to Devin next?
Is that me?
Hey.
Hey.
Yep.
Well, I certainly don't have an illustrious background as you guys. I'm a chartered accountant with Deloitte, the firm, global accounting firm. So I'm a senior manager in the audit group. From One Young World perspective, I went to Pittsburgh 2 years ago. I was basically nominated by the company to go there. What I really took away from that was really the notion of how every for-profit enterprise absolutely has to have a social component to it. No longer can you just be a corporation that makes a ton of money and pays a ton of taxes. Taxes are great because they fund all sorts of programs, but I think corporations and for-profit enterprises have to have that social component as well. There has to be a social profit that arrives out of every for-profit endeavor. So that was what I took away from One Young World Pittsburgh. Since then, I haven't been totally engaged, but got this invite from Antoine and thought I'd log on and see what you guys are up to. So here I am.
Yeah, that's great. No, and that's really good to hear. I think that a big part of sort of the work that that the coordinating ambassadors are doing across the One Young World community is sort of reaching out to people who've maybe been there for past One Young Worlds and that want to get back involved and really giving that community support, because before it wasn't always as easy. There's just a very small office in London working very hard for these things. So it's good to see, and I mean, especially in Canada, we're such a big country. I'm taking Devin, you're based in Toronto?
Actually, Cambridge, Kitchener, but I work in Toronto periodically.
Right on. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm based in Toronto now. Lived in Ottawa for 5 or 6 years, and originally from Quebec City.
Nice.
And Elias is from Montreal.
Exactly. Hi everyone, bonsoir tout le monde. Donc, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm an ambassador from the summit at Zurich. I had the pleasure to meet with Antoine and many other Canadian ambassadors, also international ambassadors in Switzerland. It was a great experience. I attended many conferences previously around the education sector, development, and youth leadership. And One Young World was one of the most inspiring initiatives or conferences I've been to. I work currently in finance at CIBC in Montreal. I'm also very involved with social business, social entrepreneurship, and technology startups in Montreal. I'm proud to hear that Ottawa might be the next city to host One Young World in 2 years. So I would be very interested to take part into maybe the planning or the organization part of the next summits. I'm also in touch with many other ambassadors from Canada, from the US, and from Africa, especially from Morocco. I'm originally from Casablanca. I have my twin brother who moved there 2 years ago, and he is also part of the MENA ambassadors. I've discussed a bit about the human rights part with him, and I'm happy to see that we will be also discussing that as Canadian ambassadors.
Yeah, yeah, that's really great. Yeah, there's we were a good gang in Zurich. We had actually tried to team up as much possible in the lead up with Eliott Béraud, who's one young world ambassador from Quebec City, who's now last I heard he's in Chile, running another startup.
He was in the UK.
But yeah, the point being is that the year of Zurich, we had tried to pitch a bunch of fundraising for a whole Canadian team to get a block of people funded to be able to go to the conference. And it's really good that we're able to build that from the corporate angle, getting Canadian companies to back it. But it's also good when we can sort of get blocks like that really help, because there's a lot of people that for whom the fundraising part is a big challenge. And in my current role, I still do a lot of fundraising, and in past roles, I've actually had to do a lot of coaching young people around fundraising for things like One Young World. So it's good to hear, and I think there'll be some really cool opportunities coming around the Ottawa bid. The other interesting thing with that, if the conference were to happen in Ottawa, there'd be some really great opportunities to get One Young World delegates traveling to other parts of Canada after the summit, and so that's something that we're keenly looking out for. So we've spent a good bit of time on introductions. I think we should probably start sort of diving into things. Because I'm moderating, could someone possibly volunteer to take minutes just of what's being said? I'm going to be reaching out also to those who weren't able to attend tonight that might have some input to put in writing, and we'll be able to really share that with the larger group in the next day or two, and then that'll be part of the report that's sent to the One Young World team in London. So do we have
yes, I can do that. Antoine, I can take the list.
Thanks, Elias. Awesome. So yeah, so we can start going right into human rights. So we'll sort of go question by question. The general question for human rights is, in what way does religion threaten human rights? So we go then into sub-questions. The first one being around religion and women in Canada or in our communities. So just to sort of start the discussion around that, there have been issues in Canada in the past with things such as honor killings, and also there's been Elias, I think, can speak really well to the large debate that happened in the past Quebec election around the role of religion and women in society, and of secularism and the place of secularism and the relationship between religion and the state, specifically seen through the lens of women in the community, especially because we're such a multicultural country here in Canada. I think that we can say a few things on that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, would you be able to maybe give a bit of a primer to Dave and Devin on what's been going on in Quebec in the last 6 months?
Yes, definitely. So I was taking the meeting minutes as we speak, just to give you an idea about what we lived actually in the last 6 months in the province of Quebec. Basically, there was a controversy or a debate around the topic of the Charter of Values, which was initiated by the last government of the Parti Québécois. The idea was to have a charter that will basically have be voted in the National Assembly as a law project in order to have more regulations for public, for public appearances. For example, for women working in the public sector, they would be forbidden to wear their veil. That was one of the most controversial regulations that the government of the past Quebec wanted to adopt. And actually, just to give you a short idea, the debate is still going on, less intensively than during the election campaign. But with the election of the new government, the new Liberal government with Philippe Couillard, now we are more focusing on the employment and economical development issues rather than the Charter of Values. I know that the minister in charge of the French language and also of the culture in Quebec want to really shed light on the Charter of Values, and they are looking into the reasons why the Parti Québécois wanted to adopt such a project in Quebec specifically. So I think for you from Toronto or from Ontario, most other Canadians were worried about the fact of the Charter of Value being proposed and maybe adopted by Quebec. So it was a big relief when the Liberal government was elected. If we go back to the human rights issues, it's basically what was controversial is the fact that forbidding, for example, a woman that will be working in the public sector from wearing her hijab or her veil would limit her freedoms, which is basically promoted by our Charter of La Charte des droits et libertés, of the rights and freedoms in Canada, and the Parti Québécois wanted to adopt an amendment to this charter, to the Charter des droits et libertés, in order to pass the new Charter of Values, La Charte des valeurs québécoises. So feel free to ask me any questions. I'm also involved in the provincial provincial politics in Quebec with the Youth Commission of the Liberal Party, and I'm also involved in the municipal sector. So I'm very passionate about politics, and it would be a pleasure to discuss more the Charter of Values with you. But in terms of human rights, it was basically against the Charter of Values, des droits et libertés, which already exists many years ago.
Yeah. So a bit more context as well. So this law that would have prohibited the wearing of religious symbols such as the Islamic veil, such as the yarmulke or the kirpan or a turban, was really it was proposed as a provincial law in Quebec. It would have possibly gone against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Quebec provincial one, and also our national constitution, of which the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a part of. So you have an issue here of federalism, which is unique to Canada. But the other thing you have here is a balancing of, on the one hand, individual rights and rights of freedom of religion versus rights of equality of access, supposedly. And there was a lot of the debate was framed through a feminist lens, saying that things such as the Islamic veil were oppressive to women. In terms of possible outcomes of what would have happened if the proposed Charter of Values, as it was called, would have came into place, would have been a limiting, essentially, on individual freedoms for a lot of members of religious communities, and especially targeting recent immigrants to Quebec in this case. So, for example, if you're a Muslim woman who wears hijab, you would have essentially been excluded from working in the public sector. So not just government employees, but also things like nurses, things as teachers, and there was a lot of even of ambiguity of whether that would eventually apply to employees in the private sector. So really, it's something that was fairly unique to Quebec. We've had in Canada, our model for religious freedom has really been based around a notion of multiculturalism that is uniquely Canadian and that's very open and accommodating and very different from the melting pot approach of American immigration policy. It's more similar to a mosaic, is the way Canadians put it. I'm explaining also all of these things so that ambassadors from other parts of the world have a bit more of the background context on what these issues are for Canada. And I'm looking at the other topics under religious side of human rights here, and this whole debate touches on a lot of those as well, with regards to social tolerance to religious minorities, and yeah, we can even talk about the issue, I think, of LGBT rights is one that does not intersect that much with religious rights in Canada as it would in some other countries. We have a fairly liberal policy on protecting LGBTQ rights as part of the human rights that are protected constitutionally under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But yeah, if perhaps Devin or David can maybe give an Ontario and Central Canada take on how the rest of Canada saw this big debate that was going on in Quebec, and particularly coming from a city like Toronto, that is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and that's incredibly diverse.
Yeah, the whole Quebec issue from the perspective of someone outside Quebec, it was a tough pill to swallow that a province in Canada, a member of Canada, would go to lengths to limit human rights or limit the religious expressions of people and all that. So it was very off-putting, I would say, that was sort of on the table. I find it interesting when the conference goes to debate a topic like this. It'd be interesting how we define sort of human rights, because from the Canadian perspective, we're so multicultural, and we're generally so tolerant of different practices and whatever LBGT and all that kind of stuff. Whereas if you put yourself in the shoes of like a Muslim country that follows Islam, and the religious teachings of Islam spell out the requirements to wear a veil and different rules that in Canada we might not necessarily view as normal. It really depends on your vantage point as to what you define as human rights and what's important to a society or a group of people or a country, as to what they think would threaten those rights, because it depends on what they define, I think. What do you guys think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the places really that Canada comes to play in this larger global debate is that we've actually had a very successful policy of both of religious freedom in Canada and also of multicultural integration that I think is particularly pertinent right now to a lot of regions and countries in the world. I mean, you look at the European elections yesterday in Europe and the election of parties like the UK Independence Party or the Front National in France that have been quite anti-immigration and quite anti religious rights in a lot of ways. I think that Canada has definitely things where it can act as a bit of a model. Canada's also been doing a lot of work recently around the promotion of religious freedoms worldwide, and the current federal government has sort of taken it upon itself as one of its key foreign policy initiatives to it even opened an office of religious freedoms. I'll just sort of steer towards another point. I think we had some really good thoughts coming out of the Quebec Charter of Values and role of secularism in society debate. The important thing also for those of you who aren't from Canada, is that outside of the province of Quebec, where this was a somewhat hotly debated issue, I think it's safe to say that Canadians were pretty unanimous in condemning the bill that was proposed as an affront to religious freedoms and individual human rights in this case. So I think as a society, it's sort of where Canada came from. It. The next sort of topic I'd like to bring up on that, I don't know if you guys have heard about this, is there's a university in British Columbia called Trinity Western University that is this Christian university, and that recently applied to open a law school, and was granted by the province of British Columbia the right to have a law school. Now, because it is a private Christian university, it does not accept gay, lesbian, and trans people as students there in their unless they like hide it or something, is my understanding of their policy. But basically they want to produce lawyers now while discriminating as an institution against the LGBT community. And there's been a lot of debate about whether students coming out with essentially what a lot of people would see as discriminatory views on the side of sexual orientation, whether they should be allowed to practice law in Canada, and whether they'd be able to practice and exert the law in a neutral way. The province of Ontario has recently put out a decision that it would not accept graduates of the Trinity Western Law Program to apply to the Ontario Provincial Bar. So it's a hotly debated issue, and even though we might not think of Canada as a country where freedom of religion sort of intersects with gay rights, there was a recent controversy around that here. I don't know if anyone has any comment or discussion on that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, David.
Oh, okay. I guess just from a kind of simple view, it's kind of ironic that you have a law school that's training lawyers in the end who will end up fight, for their clients' rights or for equality, but one of the requirements is their own rights are limited in order for them to attend the school. So I guess when you look at it from a perspective of just upholding and conducting law, it's kind of a relationship where it's very shaky, and I personally, I don't think it should be allowed to stand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a lot of controversy around that.
Mm-hmm.
The thing too in Canada that's a bit different than in a place like America is in terms of the percentage of the population that is fairly secularist minded and I'd say fairly tolerant of issues like diversity, immigration, gay rights would be larger than in certain countries. So I think in terms of most Canadians, I would feel comfortable saying would probably agree to that consensus, and it's a fairly small, albeit sometimes vocal minority that's really calling something like this into question right now. The point being is that these are small sort of fringe issues. They're not major social controversies that are a large scale part of our social dialogue, I think, in Canada. Devin, I think you had a point on here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I totally disagree that they should be allowed to discriminate and at the same time be granted a license to educate people. I was gonna add that it's an interesting microcosm in Canada where it's sort of an explicit discrimination against LGBT. And if you translate that to less tolerant countries, I think you would find the same inherent discrimination where if you're training to be a lawyer in an African country, there's probably an inherent discrimination against LGBT there as well. So maybe there's some sort of parallel you can draw from how we would construct the debate here in Canada on a much smaller scale, and to how you could apply that to a much bigger debate in a country that just inherently discriminates against that.
Yeah, yeah, and this sort of goes, I guess, into some of the broader questions with regards to what societies can do to be more tolerant and to safeguard people's human rights on things like this. And I think there are some really interesting points to be made as what a country like Canada that's actually uh, moving more and more towards promoting that as part of its foreign policy. So there's the government side is big. I think Canadian companies and corporations as ambassadors of Canadian values, both at home and abroad, can also have a role to play in that dialogue. And we've seen even like large multinational corporations engage in social debates about tolerance, essentially in a lot of countries. And I think that's something that's changing now for both for governments and for companies to do it. They do need public support behind it, public organization, and in a lot of ways a public mandate from Canadians. So we can, as individuals, we can act and work with individuals in countries where issues of religious human rights are much bigger and much more widespread and more drastic problem than they may be here. Yeah, I think it's up to individuals to organize and influence their societies, whether that's through influencing government, whether that's through speaking out as grassroots groups, or whether that's working with companies. What do you all think about that? Any other maybe suggestions on, yeah, what are the projects or the initiatives that can help out with this, right?
Companies are a very interesting route because the power of money obviously is immense. And there are laws in Canada and the US where American and Canadian corporations are forbidden from accepting bribes or operating in countries where bribes are a normal occurrence, and there are massive fines against that kind of stuff. So an interesting sort of solution to a problem like this, where certain countries don't have the same values or human rights that we would have, such as universal access to education, which is exactly the human right I think is being violated in that excellent example. Maybe there is an avenue in terms of legislating what corporations can engage in these sort of countries. I mean, simple example, like North Korea. Like, I don't think any companies are allowed to transact with North Korea because they're such immense violators of human rights. Same with Cuba. I mean, I don't think the U.S. Transacts with them still, and that's I believe that stems from human rights violations in the past. So maybe that is an interesting avenue in terms of how you sort of prevent and promote the protection of human rights in other countries.
Yeah, definitely. I think from the state perspective, and Ilyas, if you can get this in your notes, I think it's a good one to note down, is really the role of soft power, both from governments and from companies as well in promoting values. Now, on the one hand, governments can use formal diplomacy to engage in conversations on human rights, and we've seen this with the way Canada and a lot of other countries engage countries like the People's Republic of China on human rights dialogues, and also many other countries. I'm thinking specifically here of recently of the Afghan government and the Pakistani government coming out of Canada's involvement in that region and in that part of the world. One of the areas that I've done a lot of advocacy on is polio eradication. Which is an area of, you wouldn't think about it, it's an area of global health, but where religious rights actually are coming into conflict with rights to health, essentially. So the issues being that there have been um, there have been religious groups, Islamic groups in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria that have actually blocked access from community health workers to access children to give polio vaccinations. And I was part of a team that worked with the Canadian government around the commitment. Canada made a really big $250 million commitment on polio eradication last year. And I was actually part, I worked with a few MPs and senators and with the Minister for International Development. And it was really interesting to see firsthand how the issue even of the state counteracting religious groups when they stood in the way of what was really a vital public health intervention. We're talking about a case here where even the Taliban in Pakistan had issued formal letters asking religious leaders and local leaders to allow vaccinators into their communities to vaccinate kids. So the way that was shaping out, Canada was actually reluctant at one point to continue funding and making all these commitments towards polio eradication if there wasn't any local leadership. And so I was part of some discussions between Canada and the official representatives of Pakistan here in Canada through the Pakistani High Commission around looking at the steps that the Pakistani government is taking to ensure the safety of health workers, in this case, facing an obstacle of, in this case, deep religious intolerance to something like vaccinations. So it's really interesting how the issue of human rights and even how human rights intersects with religious rights influences a lot of areas in whether that's in development, whether that's in education, whether that's in law, or in this case in global health. So yeah, interesting.
And Antoine, there's a very interesting example, and actually there's Canadian examples of that too, where local religious groups were saying vaccinations are not allowable by religion, and so the children weren't getting vaccinated. And the conflicting force was that those children weren't allowed to attend public school, and then I think some exceptions were made. But it's really hard. It's really interesting. Like, how do you choose someone's right to religious freedom versus their right to education? We're basically saying you can't come to school because you're not vaccinated. That's a hard question.
Yeah, but because the question there too is that when you're not vaccinated, you're not only putting your child or yourself in danger, but you're putting in danger all the other children in that community. So really, I think the consensus that came out of that was that in this case, individual religious rights aren't absolute, and that the community's right to health and right to life trumps that in this case, which would be why there was that issue there. And I know recently in British Columbia there have been some measles outbreaks around insufficient vaccination. Now, some of that is coming from religious reasons, some of that is coming from other factors where parents choose not to do that. But there's been a debate around whether the state can mandate public health interventions that are large scale in this case. So it's an interesting debate. Now we can talk about this further, and I encourage if any of you think of anything that would be useful to have in the report that we send back to the One Young World team, to maybe forward it to all of us via email. But just being conscious of time here, and I don't want to keep us here all night either. Should we move perhaps to the second topic on human rights, which has to do with surveillance, censorship, and freedom of information, internet freedom in our community in Canada and around the world. Any opening remarks?
Just to start with, I think this was actually a heated debate during the recent months, with Edward Snowden and all the information that we suddenly realized that even the U.S. government was actually maintaining as a database to have certain information for security reasons. And I think internationally this has stirred controversy and caused a lot of debates. I think it's essentially for security reasons, but there are issues where sometimes it's also for foreign diplomacy. Other even heads of states have been surveyed by, for example, U.S. Big U.S. groups. Maybe now we can think also of social media. Companies like Facebook or Twitter or even Google have a lot of information regarding our profiles. So are we really, is this limiting our human rights? I think it depends on how we use such services, but at the same time, this can be also a concern of the large part of society, not only our generation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I personally think there's a balance that has to be drawn in this kind of area. Like, on the one hand, I love the privacy and the respect for an individual's privacy. On the other hand, I also love the prevention of terrorism, and I love the jailing of child pornographers. So if there's some balance that can be drawn between these competing forces, where somewhere I would want to land on this issue.
Yeah, I think the big issue here is a balancing of security and individual freedoms. Now, in terms of freedom of something like freedom of the press is something that's very high. Canada is one of the countries in the world with the highest level of freedom of the press. Also, although it's not always been the best, access to information on government and public access to information is increasing and is amongst the highest, not quite the highest in the world, but definitely upper tier. I think that more broadly, also there's a discussion to be had about the role of private companies collecting individual data and what are individuals' rights to privacy on something like the web. And they're different when they have to do with private companies than when they have to do with the state for purely security reasons. I think that in terms of where to find that balance as well, I think the law has an important role in safeguarding from potential abuses from the government side of things, and I think that as long as, even though they might not always be 100% transparent because of the needs of the intelligence community, if you can at least have some kind of warrant-like process for surveillance versus widespread passive surveillance, and I think in Canada it's probably been less of an issue than what we've recently seen in America, but it's still a very large issue. The other thing too has to do with foreign surveillance and also intelligence sharing with other countries, and so where do individual freedoms lie? Where does sovereignty lie within that, and where does transparency play a role? So all big issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna say that I guess with the whole recent worry about the big brother in society, it's really made us reconsider like what does it really mean to have privacy anymore on the internet. It's more, rather than having complete privacy, it's more about what do we not want to share with people, because everything else people will know about us. Another thing I think Antoine brought up was just the fading of international borders, where the whole NSA program was, as Obama said, it was more about collecting foreign intelligence, not on Americans. But for us as Canadians, that means we were under, I guess, the radar. Even though we're not American citizens, we possibly could have been, like, all of our information being collected. And I guess as an international community, what are, what's the balance, as Devin pointed out, that we need to strike between all of our countries' individual security needs, but also respecting the privacy and security of the international community.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I think also we can ask some interesting conversations right now also around the roles that Canadians are playing around the world in countries where surveillance and internet freedom and censorship are very large and pressing issues. And the role, for example, that Canadian individuals and NGOs had within the Arab Spring. I'm thinking also of right now, Canada has an elections delegation that's on the ground in Ukraine. And also just more broadly in terms of how individuals use the internet, I think there's an interesting point to be made of how quickly that's changing, and how even nowadays we consider ourselves a young generation, but if you look at the cohort that's 5-10 years younger than us, and how they use and what they use the internet for is changed tremendously from how we use the internet, and it's continuing to change. So I think the discussion around that has a role to play definitely within that larger context. So let's try and then bring the same sort of question that we asked ourselves with respects to religious rights and religious freedoms in so far as what steps and what channels can Canadians take, or can One Young World ambassadors take, whether it's as individuals, as groups, or through government channels, through private sector channels, to ensure things like freedom of the press, internet freedom, denouncing censorship, denouncing surveillance, and building things like net neutrality. All of these things. What do you think?
Antoine, just to clarify, do we need to come up with concrete action?
I think it.
Actually, it was just a question to clarify. Do we need to come up with concrete actions or specific steps that we, as for example, Canadian One Young World ambassadors, can bring actually in order to protect, for example, the privacy of, let's say, our data, or in order to safeguard the human rights in Canada? Or is it just to have a consensus around these two questions?
It's not necessarily direct actions or direct next steps, more so just general, what are the channels that people can use to affect issues like this, whether it's in Canada or whether it's around the world. I think there are much bigger issues in countries that are either not yet democracies or new democracies or fragile democracies, where issues such as censorship and internet surveillance are matters of security for the individual and of individual rights and freedoms, and a lot of the ideals that we as Canadians hold as democratic ideals.
Perfect.
So let's take a concrete example then. Let's talk about a country like Burma that's come out of decades of military rule and a climate of extremely strong direct surveillance, eavesdropping, censorship amongst the press, and human rights abuses and for example, detention of human rights activists, opposition figures, that kind of thing. Now, a country like Burma, within the past 2 years or so, has really opened up and is in a period of transition towards a democratic system, but yet lives with the after effects of strong surveillance and the way that impacts people psychologically in a lot of ways. So in a country like that, what are the steps or what are the channels that people can take to counteract that legacy and to make sure that the anti-democratic elements of their recent history don't get repeated as the transition to democracy?
One of my
I
suggestions would
think
be some.
one thing would be if they, oh, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, my internet's super slow. I'll just
David?
very quickly. One of my suggestions would be
No,
like
conference call
providing
syndrome.
providing examples to people of, here now we have this freedom of press, and we have this freedom of information, and now we've acted on it, and it's done this. Providing that example to people, I think, would be a method of breaking down that psychological barrier that they might possess from the past. And then I'm done speaking.
Yeah. I think also something like the use of multilateral diplomacy and bilateral diplomacy can really have a role to play. And I think that individuals can call on their respective countries, even though, like, using an example like Burma, as Canadians, we're not part of that, but we can definitely call on our government to bring up issues like that in dealings with the in official dealings with the government there as they continue their transition towards democracy. On the multilateral side, that can take place in forums like ASEAN in that particular case, or Burma would be granted membership to APEC or an organization like that. I think that, yeah, there's a lot to be done in terms of sort of first track government to government pressure, essentially, on issues like human rights and freedom of the press. And then there's lots of other individual actions that can be taken as part of groups or NGOs, whether that's on the ground or in the online space. And then corporations can also have a role to play in that dialogue as well. And I think from the corporate angle, this is a great segue to some of the issues around accountability and like free bidding and not taking any payments from foreign governments. That Canada has very strong transparency laws, and especially with respect to our mining and extractive sector, we've taken stronger actions on in the past years. So really, it can be part of the conversation when large Canadian companies go enter into new markets where issues like this might be the case. We lost Devin there. I'm gonna try and get him back on. Anything to add?
Antoine, yes, I see that Devin just said in the chat that she will be heading out. That's why I just said thanks.
I see that now. That's all good.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're almost done anyways. We're just about to summarize.
So I'm already into my fourth page with the meeting minutes.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. I will share it with you, maybe as a Google Doc, so we can all edit it if you have either.
That would be great, and I'll circulate it to the wider group and to people who weren't able to make the call as
Great.
well.
Awesome.
And I guess, yeah, just if we have any more thoughts, we can throw it in there. It's been already quite a long but very productive hangout. We will also, there are probably going to be more of these coming up as well in the months ahead of Dublin. And stay posted. I will have updates for you on the progression of the Ottawa bid and how we're going to activate Canadian One Young World ambassadors and how there'll be opportunities around that. In the very short term, if you think of anyone that would be influential Canadian figures that would make great counselors. That's something we're always on the lookout for. The one thing I will post, and I will ask of you, I don't know if you guys completed the One Young World survey yet. The
For me, not yet. Exactly, I received the link. I will be filling it out soon.
Super, super. If you guys can do that, it takes 5 minutes, and it means I won't have to chase you down any further after this. We're really trying to get everyone, and actually the uptake in Canada has been good so far. I'm just putting the link here. If you can take 5 minutes and do that, that would be tremendously helpful. Thanks to you both for having come out tonight and spent the time. And we'll be in touch. Hopefully, we'll be able to get Jackson on the next one. I think David, you and him go to school together. That's right.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. No, we know each other as well from several circles, so that's good. And yeah, feel free if you're in contact with any other ambassadors in the meantime, let them know what's going on and invite them to the next one of these. And in the meantime, we'll be in touch. I'll have meeting minutes for you once Yes and I have shared and digested that down. If you have anything else to add, feel free to be in touch.
Perfect. Antoine, I will share the Google Doc in my Google Drive. I will send it to you via email, and you can circulate it or share it with the ambassadors who weren't able to join tonight. I think it's a summary of what we discussed today, and I tried also to divide the conversation according to what Devin or David or you personally said. So if I missed someone, feel free to edit the documents.
Super. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Super. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you. Keep in touch. Goodbye.